reading, so we've not read it all. Who rules the world? Beyonce would say girls. I don't know, who would you say? America? China, Russia? Amazon? Google? Who rules the world? Or maybe another question, who would you say rules your world? Who makes the decisions in your world? Who directs it? What are you relying on? What are you relying on to make things right, to ensure your future, your happiness, and your success? Who rules the world? In this section of Isaiah, that's one of the big questions that's been addressed, that's been thought about. Who rules? And Isaiah reminds us who rules the world in this passage. Now, there are a couple of groups in this passage. You think they're in charge, you think they rule, who want to rely on themselves. And God has something to say to each of those groups. The first group we saw in the first part of the reading was Israel's leaders. We saw them in the first part. They think they're in charge. Now, it's quite a stupid thing to think, because actually they've just suffered a disaster. They've suffered military disaster because of their sin, as God had promised. They've been invaded. There's been some destruction to their country. And it was supposed to be a wake-up call to sort of shock them, you know, to make them evaluate their choices, to reevaluate their direction, their ways, to cause them to return to God in humility. Have a look at verse 10. What do they say? The bricks have fallen down, but we will rebuild with dressed stone. The fig trees have been felled, but we will replace them with cedars. Here's Israel's leader's catchphrase. I get knocked down, but I get up again. They're never going to keep me down. They're saying that in God's face. What arrogance. Got a little... you see it? What arrogance. They've not learned their lesson. And so you might have noticed in that reading these words that were repeated again and again. Yet for all this, God's anger is not turned away. His hand is still upraised. And we heard that again and again and again. They're chilling words, aren't they? More enemies will come. There'll be more destruction. God's saying it's foolish to shake your fist at God like that. It's like a sort of little toddler trying to defy their parents. They get put in their place, don't they? Certainly in my house. And then we saw that the leaders of Israel were particularly to blame. So verse 16, those who guide this people mislead them. Those who are guided are led astray. You might have heard of trickle-down economics. The wealth trickles down. But what we see in Israel here is trickle-down immorality. As the leaders lie and immoral, so that trickles down into the rest of the nation. And so it gets to the point by verse 17 that everyone is ungodly and wicked. Every mouth speaks vileness. And that wickedness is described as fire. It's described as destructive. You know, so often when we rebel against God, his sort of eternal judgment aside, it's destructive in our lives. We've been looking at the Ten Commandments in Friday Live, and our young people will be looking at them here soon. And they're beautiful, the way they're a bedrock for a beautiful and stable society. And yet what we see is when we turn from them, there's anarchy. Described as fire here. And then on top of that fire of wickedness, God promises to bring more fire, the fire of judgment at their sin, at the injustice that's going on. And then he says to the leaders, just as you didn't help the poor, just like you didn't help the needy, just like you wouldn't plead the case for the widow and the orphan, well, there'll be no one to help you on that day, as his anger is poured out. Who's in charge? Israel think they are. I get knocked down, but I'll get up again. God says, no, you won't. I'm in charge. And he's going to send the Assyrian army to teach them a lesson. Chapter 10, verse 6. I send him, the Assyrian, against a godless nation. I dispatch him against a people who anger me, to seize loot, snatch plunder, and to trample them down like mud in the streets. Israel's leaders don't rule the world. God does. So what can we learn from Israel, from their arrogance here? Well, I guess we might want to ask ourselves the question, are we willing to learn from the Lord's discipline? If you're a Christian here today, you don't need to fear God's final judgment. You've been forgiven, saved. The Bible says that God disciplines those he loves, like he disciplines children, like we discipline our children if we have them. And so when we see that, when we fall into sin, when we have to deal with the consequences of our sin, how will we react? Will we examine ourselves, sort of reassess, repent, submit to God, say, sorry, please help me live your way? Will we look to good leaders, not bad leaders, who will be good role models, who won't just tell us what we want to hear, but who challenge us maybe, challenge us to live God's way? Will we be positive in our response to God's discipline? Or will we go, oh, I'll get knocked down, I'll get back up again, I don't need you, God, and carry on in our defiance of him? Something to ponder, not to make the same mistake as Israel here. Second group we see, who think they're in charge in this Bible passage, Assyria, the Assyrian army. They think they're in control. Now we've seen that God is using Assyria, sovereign over everything. He's using even this Assyrian army to bring his promised justice to his people. But it's not that the Assyrians are sort of willingly submitting to God's will. So have a look at verse 6 of chapter 10. Sorry, verse 7. This is not what he intends. This is not what he has in mind. His purpose is to destroy and put an end to many nations. Assyria are just thinking they're doing it all for themselves, and it's all down to them. That they're mighty. They're in charge. Assyria's catchphrase? I am invincible. Anyone know what that's from? What film that's from?
GoldenEye.
GoldenEye, yeah. It's Boris, isn't it? I am invincible. And then he gets blown up. That's Assyria. Again, there's this arrogance in their heart. So have a look at verse 13 of chapter 10. For he says, by the strength of my hand, I have done this. By my wisdom, because I have understanding. I removed the boundary of nations. I plundered their treasures. Like a mighty one, I subdued their kings. Me. I've done this. I'm invincible. I'm in control. And they've been so successful that they're the superpower of the day. Right at the start of, you might have seen on the first slide, was a sort of a stone carving from the British Museum of the Assyrian army attacking Lachish, I think it's called, a town on the way to Jerusalem. Assyria were the superpower of the day. They had the best weapons. They were seen as invincible. You couldn't stop them. They'd conquered nation after nation. They'd removed God after God from their temple. What does God say to Assyria? Verse 15. Does the axe raise itself above him who swings it, or the sword boast against him who uses it? As if a rod was to wield him who lifts it up, or a club brandish him who is not wood. He says to Assyria, he says, you're a tool. That's what you are. You're a tool in my hands. I'll be careful with this. If I decided to cut some wood later today, who's in control? Me or the axe? Me, you'd hope so anyway. This axe will break what I want it to break. It will cut what I want it to cut. If I had enough of this axe, I could throw it in the fire or on the dump. Well, God says to Assyria, oh, you might be strong and dangerous and mighty, but you're a tool in my hands. Don't get too big for your boots. And so verse 16, God promises judgment on Assyria. The Lord will send a wasting disease upon his sturdy warriors. Under his pomp, a fire will be kindled like a blazing flame. He says, you'll burn. So what do we learn from Assyria? Well, if we sort of thought of Israel as sort of someone who is facing God's discipline or the effects of their sin and refusing to learn from it, Assyria is more like the person who's living their own way, but everything's going really well. Yeah, I'm invincible. And they might say, why do I need God? Life's good. I'm successful. I've got a nice house, a nice car, a nice family, a nice job. I'm healthy. I'm popular. I'm a self-made woman. I'm a self-made man. I'm invincible. And God says, no, you're not. There'll be a day of judgment where the arrogance that you've shown for living as if you're God will be punished, because you're not in charge of the universe. God is. He's in charge. And so the last thing we see is God's plan. The God who rules the world has a plan for his people. Verse 20, in that day, he's now promising a hopeful future. In that day, a remnant of Israel, the survivors of the house of Jacob, will no longer rely on him who struck them down, but will truly rely on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. Because as a remnant will return. He promises to rescue his people from the Assyrians. There'll be a faithful few, only a few, who will trust him through all this, rather than trusting themselves. And he'll bring them home. Says Assyria will be destroyed. And just like there's this imagery of the Exodus, when he rescued the people from Egypt through the Red Sea, he says, just like that day, I'm going to rescue you again. There's going to be freedom. There's going to be joy. There's going to be the yoke of the oppressor is going to be broken. He actually says, you're going to be so fat that you're going to break the yoke. You're going to be so healthy and eat so well. Just break off, you'll be free because you'll have so much abundance. It says, Assyria won't destroy Jerusalem, I'll stop them. And right at the end of the passage, Assyria are pictured like these big, strong trees, big, wide, sturdy, strong trees. And God says, I'm going to cut them down till nothing but a stump is left. They will be humbled, and my people will be rescued. So the challenge is, will we be like these people in verse 20? Those who, what does it say? truly rely on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. Well, we'll only do that if we believe God's in control, won't we? You don't rely on someone who you think's weak. You rely on someone who you think can help you, is mighty, who is in control. Who you think is who's in control, and you have to think they're good as well, I guess. That's who you rely on. That's who you trust. But we have even more reason than Isaiah's hearers to trust in God. Because we know, as we look back in the history books, that everything that was predicted and promised in this section of Isaiah came true. It happened just as God said it would. You can read the history books or see it in a museum. Israel were attacked by Assyria, just like God promised. Assyria was stopped at Jerusalem and wasted away and had to retreat for no reason other than God intervened, just as God promised. Assyria fell. They were destroyed by a greater nation, the Babylonians, just as God promised. And a remnant returns eventually from exile to re-inhabit the land and rebuild the temple, just as God promised. God rules. He's in control. And he calls us to trust him, whatever we're going through. He calls us to humble ourselves and not trust ourselves and think we rule the world, that we're invincible, but instead to trust him. He calls us to learn when things go wrong and turn back to him. Now, things don't always go wrong because of our sin. They go wrong for lots of reasons. But we are to examine ourselves when things happen. If verse 20 was to be rewritten for today, it would say, in these days, the church, the people of God, will no longer rely on the powers of this age, China, America, Russia, Amazon, Google, yourself, but will truly rely on the Lord, on Jesus Christ, who alone can save them, bring them home. Will you let God rule your world? He's not just mighty, he is good. Will you rely on him? There's a couple of signs that we're relying on God. One is we obey him. If we trust someone has our best interests at heart and can help us, we want to do what they say. Are we obeying Jesus? Do we know what it means to obey him? Another way we show reliance on God is through worship. Because when we worship, we take the focus off ourselves and put the focus on God. Get less of ourselves, make more of him. But actually, more than any other thing, the New Testament tells us that the visible manifestation of reliance on God is prayer. Prayer shows when we pray, we're saying, I'm not trusting myself, I'm trusting you, God, because you rule. A remnant will return. We're going to listen to a song now. It's a children's song, but I love the words. They help me understand what it means to rely on God and to pray.